All right, thanks to everybody for coming to our colloquium this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Brenda Dolan, somebody I met probably was close to 2000 time frame, back at Colorado State University, so we spent many years sort of overlapping there. With similar interests, I think Brenda does a lot from the ground, what I try to do from space, and so there's a nice intersection between the various research that we do there. So Brenda got her PhD in 2009 at Colorado State University. One of the areas that we have worked together quite a bit over the years has been on various field campaigns, but I will say Brenda's got me beat by a considerable margin in terms of the number of field campaigns she's participated in. So she's been in 13 field campaigns. One of the ones where we overlapped was LPVEX, so hence the conversation of the Finnish language that took place in Finland, 2010, I think, time frame. But we also apparently overlapped also in Olympics, although we never saw each other in either one because I was working on aircraft and she was working on the ground. And then she's got upcoming piston campaign, which is out in the...
We hope in the Philippines, off the coast of the Philippines. But if we are not granted access there, we will be in the West Pacific.
There you go. Okay, so lots of exciting stuff coming up. So Brenda's going to talk to us today about sorting rainfall size distributions and how that can help improve remote sensing retrievals and microphysical parameterizations in models.
I'm going to cover a lot of bases, hopefully, a lot of interest areas. And I'd like to thank you all for having me and all the conversations we've had today. I've really enjoyed my visit. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work. So Steve Rutledge, Brody Fuchs, Sue Vandenhever, Steve Salibi, Elizabeth Barnes, Elizabeth Thompson, and most recently, Kristen Tucker has joined our project as a master's student. So I guess I'll stand on this side. Okay, so hopefully you all know that rain can be formed through a variety of different processes, right? So you could have coalescence, you could have some riming, and then that melts and then forms rain below the bright band. You can have aggregation of snowflakes, dendritic growth that sticks together, aggregates, those melt and form rain at the surface. That rain can be subjected to breakup as it falls through the column, etc. And you get, of course, different characteristics if you're in convective, sort of strong vertical motions versus weaker motions in stratiform precipitation. So all of these result in different sizes of drops and then distributions within a volume. So it's kind of a small scale thing to be thinking about. Why do we care about this? Well, size distributions have to be assumed for remote sensing retrievals. For example, retrieval of rain rates from satellites. And my interest is in GPM, but obviously there's TRIM and other satellites out there. There's an inherent dependence between reflectivity and rain rate on the drop size distribution. And for passive microwave retrievals, we need to assume drop size distributions. Well, it turns out in models, you need to assume drop size distributions, especially in so-called bulk schemes, where you prescribe the drop size distribution a priori. And the distribution of the water in the model can influence all sorts of things like your cold pool development, the timing, the intensity of your precipitation. So it's really important that we understand rain DSDs. So how do we measure them? Well, primarily we use disdrometers. And a disdrometer is an instrument that can measure individual raindrops to provide a size distribution over a certain amount of time. The ones considered herein are every minute. There's different types of disdrometers. So there's laser optical disdrometers where your drops intersect a laser beam and that gives you some information about the size. There's impact disdrometers where the impulse is converted to a voltage and that tells you something about the size of the drops that fall. And there's 2D video disdrometers where you have two perpendicular looks at a drop where you can look at more like the shape so you can actually map out individual drops. And this is a 2D video disdrometer. This is actually a parsable from LPX. So these are just examples of 1 minute drop size distributions from various times. So you can just see that along the bottom here are the bins. This is from a 2D video disdrometer, so they're equally spaced at 0.2 millimeters. And then this is just the number of drops that fell into that bin. And you can see a variety of shapes associated with this. So how do we kind of synthesize all of this information? Well, typically we assume that the rain DSD can be described by a gamma distribution that has 3 parameters in our space mostly. Something describing the mean size, so it can either be a mass-weighted mean diameter, DM, or a volumetric median diameter, D0. And you need some information about the intercept parameter. We tend to use the normalized gamma distribution, which is normalized by liquid water content, and so we call NW the normalized intercept parameter. And you'll see that that's also a function of D0 to the 4th. Just keep it back in your head. But maybe most importantly is the gamma distribution is described by the shape parameter, which we call mu. Other people call nu, and they're related. Nu, I believe, is mu minus 1. So I've just plotted a family of gamma distributions here so you can see how this changes the shape of the rain. So the solid lines here are changing mu, and this is, the blue line here is a negative mu of -3. So you can see it's got an inverse exponential here. And then if we assume that mu equals 0, that's actually the exponential distribution, that's the black line here. And then as you start increasing mu, you get a more peaked distribution. So as mu goes to 15, you have a very narrow distribution. And then I also wanted to illustrate what it's like to change D0. So I've changed D0 from 1.5 for these solid lines to 2. So you can see that pushes out some of these larger sizes. And if I change, this is actually log NW equals 3, and all these other curves are with log NW equals 4. You can just shift this curve up and down in this direction. Okay. So thanks to agencies like DOE and NASA, and obviously many others, we have a large array of disdrometers around the globe at all different latitudes, different locations, oceanic, continental, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere. And for this project that I'm going to talk about, the data in this study is just confined to the 13 locations here, and they range in time from field projects of around 6-week deployments to 5-year records and longer.
I'm sorry, Brenda, I should have asked this before. You figure out the droplet size distribution based on spherical drops that are based on the volume of the rain that you can image?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So these 13 locations comprise over 400,000 raining minutes.
Sorry, and how many sites globally roughly are there that actually can do this measurement?
I don't know the answer to that, because every time I talk about this, somebody says, hey, I've got a disdrometer, let's use your methodology on it.
Would you mention the word hundreds or thousands or?
Probably hundreds or less, yeah.
Okay.
And we continually add to this. Like I said, I talk to people and they say, hey, I've got data. So the Piston 2018 cruise in the West Pacific had a disdrometer mounted on the ship. Relampago cacti, the DOE NSF experiment that happened last fall in Argentina, had a number of disdrometers associated with it, and I'm just starting to get my hands on this data. And a really cool data set is actually called Ocean Rain, that was by Christian Klepp, used to be at the University of Hamburg. And basically he mounted these disdrometers on a ship, and they were free spinning with the wind, so they would turn into the wind so they could measure the drop size distribution. And they put these on a whole bunch of research ships. And this is a map of where all of those ships went. So basically every ocean basin, every latitude, and they measured both snow and rain distributions. So we have a lot of data here. And how do we kind of synthesize all of this data into something that's useful? So to this, we turned to principal component analysis. Did I skip a slide here? Oh, I must have deleted it. Okay. So principal component analysis is a way to distill our data down into the highest modes of variance. And so basically we picked 6 parameters that describe the drop size distribution. In our case, we chose NW, DM, or D0. The results didn't change based on which one we used. Mu, liquid water content, rain rate, and the total number concentration. And what we get out of this is EOF, so empirical orthogonal functions, which I'm displaying here. This is each of the 6 parameters, and this is the standard anomaly. So you normalize everything, and then we're looking at the standard anomalies. And I've randomly selected the positive mode of the EOF to be these solid lines. It comes out either positive or negative, and they're exactly opposite. So I've just plotted the negative mode in the dashed lines. These are the first 2 EOFs, and the colors are basically different places in the world, different experiments. And what was surprising about this is that all of these had the same first 2 EOFs. So you can see here there may be a little bit of spread in NW, but they basically follow each other pretty exactly for both the first and the second EOF. And between these 2 EOFs, we explain almost 80% of the variance. The first one explains 52% approximately. The second one explains on the order of 27%.
And I'm sorry, not all those are parameters that you're measuring, right? LWC is liquid water content?
Liquid water content. So these
And
are
what
kind
is
of,
R?
we call it integral parameters. So from the DSD, you can integrate this and get the total liquid water content in the rain.
So is
And
this
this is
saying then that most of the variations are associated with how much it's raining, liquid water content?
Right, so we call this first EOF intensity driven. It's basically everything's either high or low. So you either have a lot of drops, they're large, it's raining heavily, having quite a number of them, or you have very few drops, they're pretty small, it's a very narrow distribution, and it's not raining a lot.
What's the NF?
NT is the total number of drops.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then the second EOF is, we call size driven, because,
So really the intensity driven is more like amount driven, right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
As opposed to size.
So I
So-
would think of size as kind of like intensity, right? Like how many really heavy, yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
No, that's
I should
okay.
let you keep going. I should just listen.
We just think of this as, yeah, so it's like heavily raining. And actually, it'll come out later, this is kind of like convective, it's kind of like stratiform.
Okay.
The positive and negative modes of EUF1.
Okay.
So EUF2, now there's very little variability actually in liquid water content and the rain rate, but there's high variability in NW and D0. So you can think about this in that there's a lot of size distributions that could give you the same amount of rain, right?
Isn't that true in the intensity-driven set of curves? You have the
It
same
is
range
true.
of variability in
Right,
D0.
but in this one, okay, in this one you have still high D0, high number concentration.
Oh, they're positively correlated in that
Yeah.
case. I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, this got flipped, that's what happened. Okay.
Can you look at is there some way to visualize what the distributions look like for these
Yes,
different parameters?
and I will
Okay.
show you. Yeah. Okay, so what else comes out of EOF analysis is that each observation is associated with a principal component, which tells you how well that observation fits into your EOFs. So you can do the principal component of the first EOF, principal component of the second EOF for each observation. So what I'm showing here is every observation in our data set, and this is a contoured frequency. So these brighter colors are more frequent observations, the darker colors are less frequent observations. And so I plotted PC1 versus PC2, and what we get out of this is that the majority of the points actually fall near the global means, and that's kind of what we would expect out of EOF analysis. We really want to look at kind of the outliers. But some other things is that in this space, we're asymmetric, so we see some kind of branches, and then there's some limits that are probably associated with natural limits, like rain rate can't be less than 0, can't have a number of drops less than 0. So that's probably what these boundaries are about. But kind of keep this in the back of your mind because I'll come back to this. So we can start selecting some of these branches of outliers for further analysis. So I've selected to pick PC values with a standard deviation greater than 1.5. And the results don't change based on what this threshold is. This is just how much we're separating our data. So I call group 1 when we have high PC1. I call group 2 when we have negative PC1. Group 3 when we've got positive PC2. Group 4 when we have negative PC2. Group 5 when we have both positive PC1 and positive PC2. And then group 6 when we have positive PC1 and negative PC2. So I probably lost you at this point, but what we can do is essentially start looking at how these groups, the characteristics of these groups. So I've plotted the data here for high, middle, and low latitudes in log NW D0 space. And I've color-coded the points based on those thresholds that I just outlined and the group numbers. And I've plotted here for you the actual size distributions associated with the mean of the points that fall into these different groups. So for example, group 1 is a fairly wide distribution. You have high liquid water contents, high rain rates, low mu. Mu is actually near 0 for this distribution. And we see maybe more of a component of this in the low and middle latitudes compared to the high latitudes. Group 2 has some overlap with group 3, the yellows. It's a fairly narrow distribution. Group 3 is this yellow, maybe a little bit bigger, but we still have a fairly narrow distribution, a lot of drops, they're very little. Group 4 is actually nearly exponential, this blue group here. And we see we have fairly low log NW, kind of moderate but largish D0s. And then group 5 is interesting because we see it's most prominent in the low latitudes, but it's associated with really high rain rates, moderate sizes, D0 approximately 1.5 to 2, but pretty high log NW, so lots of drops. In group 6, this purple we see mostly in the mid-latitudes, very large drop sizes, fairly low number concentrations, and that's associated with that negative mu values. And we know from previous studies that in this log NW space, D0 space, other researchers have shown you can start separating convective and stratiform rain. And that's what's shown by this dashed line here. So above this is typically convective, and below this is typically stratiform. And we kind of see some of that falling out of our statistical analysis. Okay, so this kind of brings up a number of questions. What are these groups? What are their microphysical origins? What is the spatial variability of these different groups? We already saw there was kind of latitudinal variability in some of those groups. What role is the environment playing in this? So I have what I call my holy grail question, which is, can we link these observed surface DSDs to the microphysical processes aloft? And if we could do this, we would be able to help improve model parameterizations of size distributions and processes. We could help guide remote sensing retrievals, and we could actually use observations to study cloud processes on a large scale and examine how they might be changing with climate if we have a long enough data record. Okay, so I'm going to appeal to some other data sets to try to answer some of these questions. So what I didn't tell you is the map of Disdrometers on one of my previous slides. Every one of those was co-located with a polarimetric radar observation. So we can use this to start putting those point observations into a vertical and horizontal context. And then we're going to bring in some reanalysis data from MERA2 and Geospatial to look at the thermodynamic and aerosol backgrounds associated with each of these groups. And then we're going to appeal to mesoscale cloud resolving models to help us really try to analyze microphysical process rates. We're going to use the Regional Atmospheric Modeling System, RAMS, to do that. Okay, so first, what are these 6 groups? So what I did is I took the Disdrometer data, and from my PCA analysis, I picked out each of the groups. And then I looked at RHI data from the polarimetric radars over the Disdrometer, which is given by this diamond, to kind of contextualize what's happening. So this is group 1, and we see a very convective RHI here. It's right in the heart of that convection. In contrast to group 2 points, which are located here under a very kind of uniform stratiform. We see very uniform reflectivities aloft, nice radar bright band, and then fairly uniform reflectivities below that. Group 3, which was that very narrow distribution, had a high number of drops, very small in size. Turns out this is an example from the tropics, from Don Island, and we're basically not even poking through 2 kilometers in ecotop height, and the reflectivities are fairly constrained to less than 30 dBz, let's say. Group 4, again, the Disdrometer's right here. You see a nice radar bright band, but now there's some more texture in the reflectivities, maybe even some continued coalescence as we see reflectivity increase towards the surface, and a little bit more structure aloft. Group 5, which I said is fairly prominent in the tropics, sits up here with sort of moderate sizes, large log NWs. This is actually an example of orographic from IFEX, which was in North Carolina. But you see the high reflectivities are mostly contained below the bright band. So there's probably a lot of warm rain collision coalescence happening here. And lastly, we have that group 6 that had a low concentration of fairly large drops. And here's a nice case from MC3E in Oklahoma. There's the convective core here, and the Disdrometer actually sits off to the side, but it's not in stratiform. So maybe this is sort of a transition region. Maybe we're getting some melted grapple kinds of influences into that DSD. Okay. So those were a couple of handpicked examples. I basically took all of the RHIs associated with each of these groups in various locations. These are the high latitudes, mid latitudes, low latitudes. These are mean profiles of reflectivity, differential reflectivity, and then ecotop height versus the reflectivity at 2.5 kilometers, which is kind of an intensity measure, if you will. And we can start saying things like group 6 and group 1 have the highest ecotop heights in all of our latitude bands. Group 2 and 3 are relatively shallow in nature. In fact, group 3 is maybe the lowest ecotop heights. We can see some signs of aggregation in group 4, which is going to be hard for you guys to see, and some signs of collision coalescence in group 5, this orange line here. So from all of this, we put together a conceptual model that we think kind of sorts the rain by these statistical properties that we came up with. So for example, we labeled group 1 general convection, and group 2 is general stratiform. And this is actually associated with those PC values. So as we go negative PC1 to positive PC1, it follows this along the chart. And then we have group 3, which we've labeled shallow weak convection, and group 4, which we think is when you have kind of aggregation and bigger ice crystals aloft that are melting, is down here. So as we increase PC2, we go from down here to up here. Then group 5, we've labeled warm rain or robust collision coalescence, and that sits up here. And then we go to more ice-based convection, maybe melted grapple, like I said, we've got mixed phase ice processes contributing to the surface-based readings. And I will point out, these are kind of, it's more important to think of these as sort of trends. It's not like if we got a DSD right here, we could label that as coming from convection. But you can kind of look at the distribution of them, and if you have a lot of them happening up here, then you would probably have a lot of robust collision coalescence. So these gray points are actually most of the points, which I've shown the frequency plot up here, and you can see that's in the same region here. So again, we're just looking at kind of the outliers. Okay. So what role does the environment play? And what is kind of the spatial distribution of these groups? So I'm showing here the relative frequency of each of the groups, and I've removed the gray points where we can't really say anything about what they are. And I ordered them by increasing absolute magnitude of latitude. And I've kind of generally indicated here where the high, middle, and low latitudes lie. And then our oceanic sites are highlighted in blue, and the continental sites are in red. So some things we can start saying now is that we have more frequent warm rain, that orange group, in the low latitudes. And we maybe see increasing shallow rain contributions with increasing latitude. You see these bars getting larger. There's maybe some, orographic things happening in Hymex, which was in the Alps. But generally, we can see that. We see the most ice contributions, that purple group, in our continental locations. And we maybe see an increasing convective component with increasing latitude as well. Okay, so we can also break this down by components. So, and I don't mean principal components. I mean the parameters that we put into this. So here is a geospatial frequency of view. This is for our convective group, our stratiform group, our ice-based group, and our weak shallow group. And the different line styles are the low, middle, and high latitudes. And I've just highlighted here the global distribution if you put them all together. So most algorithms, including GPM, have to assume some mu, and typically they pick 3, which actually is a reasonable assumption given the global distribution. It kind of peaks right near 3. However, that's pretty dependent on the population in the region that you're looking at. So you can see in stratiform and these weak shallow, the mu's are much higher. So they're 5 to 15. Whereas if you're looking at more ice-based, the mu is, as we saw earlier, 0 or negative. And so, could this be related to underestimation of precipitation in the high latitudes if you're assuming a mu of 3, but it's really 15? It's telling you how your water is distributed, perhaps incorrectly.
Do you know what the amount of rain would look like on these plots? Is that your stratiform versus convective, or amount variations? Like, it seems like the first principal component is going to be related to just the amount of rain that you have, because that's going to vary everywhere.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Is this is really PC1? Is so you're going to have either a lot of rain or a little bit of rain.
Okay.
Yeah.
The weak shallow clouds. Are examples like great and cumulus, or what does weak mean?
In this sense, like less than 30 dBz, and maybe ecotop heights are like 2 to 3 kilometers, and certainly not penetrating the melting layer. So now I'm going to look at the environmental influence, and I'm going to use Darwin as an example. It's kind of a natural laboratory. It's a coastal location in northern Australia. And it has both oceanic and continental influences. So you get these monsoon winds that bring clean oceanic moist air over the site, which is here in red. And you get break periods where you get dirty continental air flowing over that same location. We have a Disdrometer there that has approximately 3 seasons. So we have over 42,000 rating points. And this is where we're going to bring in MERA2 data and GSChem to get at CCN concentrations and warm cloud depths, which is related to the melting level height on the cloud base. Okay, so what we did is for each Disdrometer measurement, we interpolated the closest reanalysis thermodynamics and aerosol concentrations. And in the background gray contoured here are the frequency of each of these 2D points in warm cloud depth and CCN concentrations. And then we took the mean of our groups, so the mean CCN and the mean warm cloud depth associated with each of our Disdrometer identified groups. And you can see immediately they start separating in terms of their means in warm cloud depth and CCN. So when we have high CCNs and low warm cloud depths, we actually see we're getting more of that ice-based convection, so you're pushing more of the liquid up into the mixed phase region. As you have deeper warm cloud depths, you're promoting more of the warm rain-based collision coalescence, and we get more of this group 3 and group 5. So I will say that this variability is most noted during the break periods, and that's actually just driven by the background environment. And, you know, warm cloud depth and CCN tend to be correlated in Darwin, and that's probably just because you're bringing in that drier, more dirty air versus very clean maritime air.
Yeah. But it's dirty in one sense, and it's not dirty in another sense. I mean, it's dusty probably. It's probably
Right.
got some, you know, pollutants in it. But on the other hand, you have tons of sea salt coming in when you have
Yeah.
the monsoon wind. So that's dirty too, but in another way,
Yeah.
it benefits the growth of big
And
drops.
I did break it down by sea salt. So we had 5 different kinds: carbon, sea salt, sulfates.
Mhm.
I can't remember the other 2. And the sea salt, you really see that actually during the monsoon.
I
There's
imagine
some,
you would.
you know, correlation there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does that figure into some of the separation that you're talking about? I guess I can't follow it quite that to the detail that you can. So how does the salt figure in?
Well, I don't remember exactly what it looked like, but this is more of the sulfate
Okay.
response here.
Are they soluble too in the water?
I believe so. I
okay.
can't remember exactly. This all comes from Geospatial
Okay.
model, which, you know, predicts on that, so
Okay.
I don't remember. Okay. So we can start looking at the rainfall variability in terms of things we can measure. So let's say we can measure the mass weighted mean diameter and things we're interested in retrieving, such as rain, or radar reflectivity and rain. And I've just color-coded these 2 plots by their PC1 values. So again, we kind of see this, just PC1 just increases with rain rate and size. And there's really no relationship here that's falling out between reflectivity and rain rate, DM and RR. So, you know, this is typically the convective stratiform kind of dichotomy, and that's not really the way that these are separating. But if I go to PC2, which was telling us more about the DSD, now we see maybe curves between DM and R. So high PC2 values are where you've got a lot of water content in smaller drops. Negative PC2 is where we've got lower rain rates with maybe larger sizes. And similarly with the ZR relationship. So this is maybe a lot of water content in moderate reflectivities, and here you're getting less rain for a given reflectivity. So PC1 and PC2 are actually telling us a lot about how the DSD is relating something we can measure to what we're interested in retrieving.
Does this split between ocean and continent too?
What do you mean split?
In the sense that you'd have maybe bigger drops but fewer precipitation particles in the ocean, the maritime may have versus the continental may
Right,
have?
so we did see the same variability in all locations that we looked at, but I don't have the answer to that question quite yet. So this has implications for remote sensing. For example, maybe if we knew something about the environment, if we were in a deep warm cloud depth or something, we could say something about what mu is. Perhaps we could link the curves that are used in our retrievals based on something we know about the environment. So for example, we could select an epsilon. So this is how the GPM DPR retrieval works, is that you have these different curves relating DM to rain rate, and we call these epsilon. So we could pick the epsilon curve that best matches the environment in a given location. Or we could use, like I said, a mu value that maybe better represents the cloud types that you're looking at. If you're in that shallow, weak regime, you need to use a much higher mu value. Okay. So now on to that big question of what are the microphysical origins of these 6 groups, and are they indicative of processes aloft? So for this, we're going to use the RAMS model, which we've selected because not only are they at CSU, but it's an advanced model with, quote, bin emulating 2-moment microphysics scheme. It has the ability to track the microphysical process rates, and it's been used to simulate a range of cloud systems, which I'll show on the next couple slides. Before we can address these main questions, though, we have some smaller challenges to address. I would call the 0th order problem converting model mixing ratios and number concentrations into our normalized DSDs that we're observing. And Steve Salibi actually did this for me, so check. I can move on to number one. So, the next question we ask is, do the model simulations capture the same DSD variability that we see in the global Disdrometer data set? It's an important question to ask if we're going to use this to try to track down what the groups are. And then we have these questions of, in bulk models, the size distribution is assumed, and in a two-moment scheme, the shape parameter is fixed. What impact does that have on being able to see the DSD variability? And part 2B would be, how do bin models, where there's a freely evolving size distribution, compare to the observations, and can bin models capture this variability that we see?
What do you do with large-scale forcing? Are you just going to use the same large-scale forcing? Because that's the other when you want to make the connection between a model and the...
Yeah, so we're gonna start doing some idealized simulations.
So no large-scale forcing?
Yeah, we haven't started that work yet, though.
Okay.
So I don't know quite the answer to that.
Because these might be tied, these variations might be tied to differences in vertical motion profiles
Yeah,
too?
right.
Like based on some of my work, I would guess that that's the case.
Yeah.
So,
Exactly. So we're still kind of narrowing down how we're gonna do exactly answer these questions. And then, there's even the question of how do we link the microphysical process rates in a column to their surface DSDs? There's advection, there's lots of different processes that are acting on it. How do we narrow all that down? I'm not gonna get into these two in this talk. I'm gonna go after this question here. So the first thing we did is just take the simulation database that Sue Vandenhever's group already had and start probing it a little bit. So there have been quite a number of studies that have looked at different precipitation environments. So we've got sea breezes, we've got the boreal summer interseasonal oscillation, kind of a oceanic tropical simulations. We've got supercells, we've got oceanic and continental convection, we've got mid-latitude MCSs. So we've broken down by type, and these cooler colors here are tropical locations, warmer colors are mid-latitude continental. We have approximately a 50-50 split between these two. So just without any information about whether there was stratiform, convective, shallow, whatever, we looked at the distribution in terms of log NW D naught. So this is that same observation frequency plot. This is what we get out of RAMS. And immediately we see some differences. So first of all, the D naughts tend to be much smaller. Log NWs are actually sit a bit higher than our observations. And really we're missing this breadth as we increase this direction. RAMS is fairly contained in this space. So a couple of questions that come out of this: how much do we, trust our observations? I would say, it's possible that we're missing those really small drops. That's a detection limit of the Disdrometers. So it could be that this actually happens in nature. But maybe some of this constraint here is because we had to assume a fixed mu. So if we start changing mu, maybe we'll see some spread here. Okay, but given all of this, we just applied the principal component analysis to all of the RAMS data, and surprisingly, actually, we get nearly the first two EOFs similar to our observations, which was like, whoa, how did this happen? So RAMS is given in red, and our global observations is given in gray here. So there are some differences. You see NW actually has the opposite response in RAMS, so it's negative in this positive, what I've defined as the positive EOF. And then Where we really saw the DSD shine in PC2, because there was very little variability in log NW, or liquid water content and rain rate, RAMS actually has a bit of variability in that in the second EOF. So we are seeing some differences, but surprisingly, they trend in the same direction. So this is that same PC1, PC2 scatter plot, and now I've contoured the frequency of our observations in the black contours, and RAMS is in the scatter in the background. And we don't see nearly the same breadth that we do in the observations, and we start to see some maybe concerning things like this correlation between PC1 and PC2. Now if I plot in log NW D0 space, and I've color-coded the groups the same here, the observations are outlined by their group color, and then RAMS is color-coded by its group color. We actually see that we sit in the same relative space. So yellow's up here, purple's down here, red's over here, green's over here, but not the same absolute space between the observations and the models. And you can clearly see that contrast in breadth now that I've overplotted them. And maybe most interestingly, we see this prominent feature at 1 millimeter, which we affectionately have named the RAMS horn, because we're using RAMS, but we're also the CSV RAMS. Okay. So the RAMS horn actually shows up in nearly all of the simulations that we have. This is an example from an MC3E mid-latitude convection in Oklahoma. We see a very prominent RAMS horn, and actually we see a RAMS horn happening in group 4, and that's not something that we've ever seen in our observations. You can actually see it in the log NW D0 density plot as well. It just pings basically 1 millimeter size. Okay, so what's happening here? Steve Salevi started doing some testing. So he just took some different simulations, and this is subtropical convection. It has fairly good liquid water contents. And he looked at full microphysics, the D0 frequency distribution, and when he only had the warm phase microphysics. And guess what? Both of them pinged this 1 millimeter. So that really points to this being something happening with the warm phase microphysics parameterization. He also looked at a supercell thunderstorm, same peak at 1 millimeter. Interestingly, he went to shallow stratocumulus. They have much lower liquid water contents, barely precipitating. Well, now we see that this has shifted. It's not at 1 millimeter anymore. Okay, so he narrowed this down to the raindrop self-collection efficiencies parameterization. This is using Ferlindi and Cotton 1993. So basically, when you have small sizes, you have a collection efficiency of 1, so they're going to start collecting each other. As they get bigger and bigger, you drop off the collection efficiency, and then as you start getting even larger, they start breaking up. So you have negative collection efficiencies associated with breakup. And what happens is you start oscillating around this point where your collection efficiency is equal to 0. Because you're going to grow these, and then they're going to break up, and then you're going to grow these, and then they're going to break up. So this is actually noted in this paper that this kind of behavior occurs. So this method of parameterizing the drop breakup will always force the drop mean size to converge towards that point where E equals 0. Steve tested this. He did a test curve where he just increased where E equals 0, and it started pinging that size.
The Dolan observations show that that's the case, though, because when we designed RIMS, we always tried to look for an equilibrium distribution, you know, around 0.6 of 0.6 radians, so it'd be like 1.2. I think that's where you are, and that's shown in observations that you tend to get an equilibrium between breakup and
I would say that's probably true, but it's being over constrained here. So it's not allowing really any larger drops So, that may be true if you have an equilibrium distribution, but we don't always have an equilibrium distribution. Okay, and this is actually the parameterization that's used in most metaphysics schemes, Morrison, Thompson, so this is going to be something that's seen in those as well. And it has implications. It's not a simple fix. We've been talking with Graham Feingold. He provided this gem of a quote that the problem with breakup is the poor knowledge of the breakup kernel. We don't really have enough science behind it to create a parameterization of drop breakup. As I showed before, we could change the collection efficiency, basically shift those curves around. There have been some other parameterizations that change these collection efficiencies, which are shown here. This is from a Morrison et al. 2012 paper looking at drop breakup parameterizations. And basically, changing these has implications on your cold pools, your evaporation, your precipitation, even your propagation speed. So this is simply 3 MCSs with different collection curves, just shifting them around here. And you can see the extent of the stratiform changes, the propagation speed changes. So this has important feedbacks, and we don't have an answer for this yet. So in summary, we use principal component analysis to sort our rain into 6 different groups. And from radar observations, we sort of inferred some characteristics about these 6 groups, such that we can start labeling them. And then we started looking at how this trends spatially in different locations, but also how the environment might be influencing this. And we wonder if this can maybe help provide some constraints on remote sensing retrievals. This analysis methodology provided a framework for using observations and simulations together. It was a novel way for evaluating the microphysics schemes. We showed that the breadth of the DSD is not currently captured. It highlighted this ram's horn, which was determined to be an artifact of the collection and more specifically the drop breakup parameterization. But since we saw that the results from rams were still kind of relatively the same thing that we saw from our observations, we think we can still use the model to help us try to pin down what microphysical processes might be contributing to the DSDs that we see at the surface. So with that, I will stop and take any questions. She had her hand up first.
Super interesting work. I think this approach of doing an EOF analysis on the shape and size parameters and stuff is really interesting. I've spent a lot of time looking at EOFs of vertical motion, and that's kind of a boundary condition in your RAM simulations.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could relate these different microphysical processes to vertical motion EOFs.
That is actually exactly what I'm starting to do. So I just got W from these same simulations, and I want to start incorporating that.
W is a boundary condition in the simulations, essentially.
Okay.
So it's not really like usually W is a boundary condition in these kind of simulations.
Okay.
So I would expect that the amount of precipitation would be EOF1, and that's just the amount of upward vertical motion you have. And then EOF2 would be the bottom heaviness versus top heaviness.
Okay.
And so I think that that's probably what you'll see. You could just regress onto the vertical motion that's being used as a boundary condition.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was
And so it might
starting.
actually be that this process is kind of not just a microphysical thing, but also a dynamical thing.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
what we know from observations is that convection over land tends to be more top-heavy, which is consistent with what you're showing. And then also, we also know something about what the errors in radar retrievals are for different types of convection, and that's also kind of consistent with this picture.
Yeah, it's great feedback.
Yeah, so that'd be an interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, thanks.
And it sounds like you're already on the right track.
Well, I haven't started that yet, but that's, if I had future work, that would be.
But just like a regression is what I would do to regression of vertical motion.
Okay.
That's being used as boundary conditions in the simulations.
Okay, great.
Is there any value, Brenda, in figuring out how far of a difference there is from the boundary of, I don't know the colors with the
Yeah.
numbers, but region purple in the
Yeah.
OBS and region purple in the model? How far does it, how much distance is there if you add up, a whole bunch of elements on the boundaries of the two portions of the phase space? Is there any one of those 6 groups that looks
That's
really pretty
farther
good?
off.
Yeah, and then
Yeah,
others
yeah.
that look worse? And does that give you a clue about what's going on in the model?
Yeah, I haven't, I would say, yeah, maybe the yellow and the orange are, better
Right,
captured
that's what
by
it
the
looks like
model,
by
and,
eye.
Purple and red are maybe not so much, but
Right.
that's an interesting
And is
approach
there a
I hadn't
way
thought about.
to put a metric on that
Yeah.
difference? That would be kind of
Yeah.
interesting. And the other question I have is, can you, with simultaneous observations with the Disdrometer, the model, and reflectivity, and rain rates, can you kind of get an idea what fraction of the population of droplets exceed the too big a drop for the RANS model? And then, does that
Because it is
vary with the different
infrequent.
kinds of environments?
Yeah, these are pretty infrequent values,
Mhm.
actually. Yeah,
But they're the ones that may hold great sway in the cold pool and some other
Yeah,
things, because there's a
yeah.
lot of water that's
Right.
evaporating in those
Yeah.
cases,
yeah,
So,
okay. Good.
it's really interesting.
This is kind of outside my field of knowledge, but thinking about Melissa's question, is there already built into the understanding of these different regimes the effects of turbulence, the quantitative effects of turbulence in terms of determining the distributions and the transitions between the different regimes?
I would say no. We didn't include anything like a Doppler spectrum or anything that would tell us something about turbulence.
I was thinking about turbulence affecting planes.
Oh, yeah, definitely not any information there in what I've done so far.
It strikes me that maybe some of these transitions are related to the intensity of vertical motion and
Okay.
the associated turbulence.
Okay. So we could look at that maybe from a model perspective? I don't know how we would observe.
Wherever your
that,
imagination takes you.
but- Okay.
Thinking about convective rain, we get a lot of size sorting,
Yeah,
and so trying to fit that together with this classification, it
Yeah.
must be a huge range.
yeah. I mean, I think size sorting is actually happening kind of up here. But there's certainly lots of different processes that are acting on this, so maybe we can't pinpoint just one that is associated with a given group.
So do you have a way to maybe go about fixing the ram's horn?
No. We are open to suggestion if anybody has a different microphysical parameterization or a way of handling drop breakup.
I could say that the Rams one is really built in, because when we wrote Rams initially, we had to estimate where breakup would occur. And we used observations of equilibrium distributions, but I remember there were 2 observations. One was an equilibrium about 1.3 millimeters diameter, the other one was about 1.08 millimeters diameter. That's the range we had, so we automatically tuned it. Matter of fact, you didn't have to do a 5-moment distribution. We originally just did one with a constant slope, and the constant slope to the Marshall-Palmer distribution was that value. And then when we tried to do 2 moments, we wanted it to wind up creating an equilibrium at that point, because that was where the observation is. So I think probably it boils down to, how are you going to parameterize breakup?
Yeah.
Because it's not easy.
Well, and we talked about, I gave this version of this talk last Friday at Sue Vandenhuver's group meeting, and we talked how maybe, it's kind of like a stochastic answer where like some of them are allowed to grow, because like you said, there are equilibrium distributions where we should be getting something right in there, but it's just that it's kind of limiting because you don't really allow it to get much larger than that, some of those drops.
But
Yeah.
the only way it can really get larger than that is for you to evaporate away the smaller droplets, right? Because if they're growing, if they're actively growing, you shouldn't stop at the equilibrium distribution. So the only way to get
Well,
bigger
but
is to
we
get
see
rid of the
much
smaller.
larger drops in nature
Yeah,
that
nature
aren't
doesn't care about
necessarily, I mean, so some of these larger drops may be having an ice core that's holding them together, you know, to keep them, you
Right.
know,
But-
stable.
But they're going to reach an equilibrium if they go long enough. So if you have a short period of time, you can wind up being big for a while. But if it's a longer period of time, they wind up in the equilibrium distribution unless you just get rid of the smaller ones some other way. You know, you see what I mean? So that how you come about bigger droplets, like you said, you could melt ice initially, and maybe it would shed off bigger droplets for a while, but they would quickly equilibrate into this equilibrium distribution. That's what it shows. So it's a matter of timing and a matter of being able to get the small ones. They can, when your rain is evaporating, that's when you typically get bigger droplets, because then the smaller ones go first and you're left with the bigger ones. And that's one thing we've never really been able to do, but we can sort of manage to get some of that during evaporation parts. But the other parts, like you're talking about, before it gets into new equilibrium, that's hard to do, because I don't know if there's enough observations or enough theory.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that your model results, though, it's bimodal at the top of the distribution, and it's bimodal in the observations at the
Yeah.
top of the
I
distribution.
know, I've
just
noticed
flattened
that
out.
too, is that this actually has a peak there.
Yeah.
Which is probably the equilibrium distribution. But it's just that RAMS is kind of constrained to that and
Yeah, and
forcing
then-
everything to that when it needs to broaden some of it, but keep some of that peak there too.
Right. So
how
nature
do you
just,
represent that, you know?
I don't know. Unless you know what population of bigger than that size drop survived from observations. And then you can just, maybe you just add an extra piece of line of somewhere in the code and say, except for.
Yeah,
You know.
allow a couple of these.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Well, you know,
Like Maxwell's demon or something.
here's another question I've always come up on. When ice crystals are shedding droplets, how big are those shed droplets?
Well, we looked at whether this was actually a shedding, you know, like it was shedding them all at 1, millimeter or something like that. And actually, if we turned shedding off, this was still there. So I don't know the answer to your question.
Those
into whether
are
that
the
was a root
questions you're
cause.
faced with when you're writing a parameterization.
Right.
What do you do?
Yeah.
It's really good.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.